"Ma'am, you can't sit here," the officer said, his voice flat, practiced, the kind that didn't expect to be questioned. And for a second the entire cafe seemed to inhale at once, as if the air itself had been pulled tight across the room. Every cup, every spoon, every quiet conversation pausing mid-motion under the weight of that sentence, as Officer Daniel Brooks stood beside the small corner table where Evelyn Carter sat with both hands wrapped gently around a paper coffee cup that had already begun to cool, her fingers thin, steady despite the years etched into them. Her coat worn at the cuffs but clean, carefully brushed as though dignity could be pressed into fabric if you tried hard enough. And she looked up at him not with fear, not even with confusion, but with a calm that didn't belong in a moment like this, the kind of calm that came from a life lived longer than most people in the room could imagine. While sunlight slipped through the tall front windows and landed across the table in a pale gold stripe, catching the rim of her cup, the edge of the wooden chair, the soft gray in her hair as it rested neatly against her temple, and somewhere behind the counter a machine hissed, too loud now in the silence, drawing a few uneasy glances from customers who quickly looked away again, choosing distance over involvement as Brooks shifted his stance, one hand resting near his belt, not aggressive but firm in a way that carried its own quiet authority, the kind that assumed compliance before resistance was even considered. And he glanced briefly at the manager near the register who gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. A signal passed between them without words, while Evelyn's eyes drifted slowly across the room, taking in the polished marble countertop, the soft jazz humming through hidden speakers, the neatly dressed patrons who sat straighter now, their postures subtly aligned with the officer's presence. And then back to him, her voice when it came soft but clear. "I paid for my seat," she said, each word placed carefully, not defiant, not pleading, just true, and it hung there for a moment, fragile and solid at the same time, like something that shouldn't need to be defended but somehow did. And Brooks exhaled through his nose, a quiet sound, almost a sigh, as if this were an inconvenience rather than a moment, his gaze dropping briefly to the table, to the receipt folded beside her cup, then lifting again without acknowledgement. "Ma'am, I'm asking you to leave," he replied, a little sharper now, the edges of patience thinning as a chair scraped lightly somewhere behind them, the sound quick, nervous, and then gone, swallowed by the same silence that had taken hold of the room. And Evelyn didn't move, not immediately, her hand tightening just slightly around the cup as if grounding herself in something small and real while the world around her shifted into something colder, something less forgiving, and the light across the table seemed to dim as a cloud passed overhead, leaving her face in softer shadow, her features still, composed, as though she had stood in moments like this before, as though she understood something no one else in that room had yet begun to see. And Brooks stepped a fraction closer, not touching, not yet, but close enough that the space between them carried weight, expectation, the unspoken assumption that this would end the way it always did, quietly, quickly, without resistance. And still she remained seated, her back straight, her presence gentle but immovable, like a line drawn not in anger, but in truth. And for just a second longer than it should have lasted, no one in that cafe moved at all. The receipt beside Evelyn's cup had been folded with careful precision, edges aligned as if habit had taught her that order was something you created for yourself when the world around you did not offer it freely. And as Officer Brooks stood waiting, his patience thinning in small, controlled breaths, she slowly reached for it, her movements unhurried, deliberate, the faint rustle of paper sounding louder than it should in the quiet room. And she placed it flat against the table, smoothing it, once with the palm of her hand as though presenting something more than proof of payment, something closer to principle, while a young barista behind the counter glanced over, eyes flicking between the officer and the elderly woman, uncertain, her hands hovering over the register without touching it. And a man in a navy blazer near the window shifted in his seat, crossing and uncrossing his legs, the subtle discomfort spreading through the room like a ripple no one wanted to acknowledge. And Evelyn's gaze lowered briefly to the receipt before lifting again, not to challenge, not to confront, but to remain present in a space that seemed to be closing around her. "I come here every morning," she said, quietly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard without demanding attention, Same time, same seat. And there was something in the way she said it. Not defensive, not insistent, but rooted, like a statement tied to memory rather than permission. And for a fraction of a second Brooks hesitated, not visibly enough for anyone else to notice, but long enough for something in his expression to flicker, a question perhaps, quickly buried beneath training and expectation as he glanced again toward the manager, who now stepped a little closer, arms folded lightly across his chest, posture careful, measured, as if maintaining distance from responsibility while still guiding the outcome. "Ma'am," the manager said, his tone polite but edged with finality. "We have policies." And the word lingered, vague and convenient, filling the space where explanation might have been, and Evelyn nodded once, a small motion, acknowledging the word without accepting it, her fingers resting lightly against the table now, no longer gripping the cup, as if she had already decided that holding on to something physical was less important than holding her place. And the light shifted again as the cloud passed, returning warmth to the room in a soft wash that touched her face first, illuminating the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, lines that spoke of years, of endurance, of moments lived quietly and without witness. And Brooks cleared his throat, the sound firm, grounding him back into the role he understood. "Ma'am, if you do not leave, I will have to escort you out," he said, each word measured, controlled, but carrying the weight of inevitability. And a few customers lowered their eyes at that, retreating into their phones, their cups, their silence, choosing not to see what was unfolding just a few feet away. And Evelyn drew in a slow breath, her shoulders rising barely an inch before settling again, her gaze steady as she looked past Brooks for just a moment, toward the far wall where framed photographs hung in neat rows, images of ribbon cuttings, smiling groups, a history displayed in polished glass and gold trim. And something in her expression softened, not with sadness, but with recognition, as though she were looking at a story she knew by heart, one that no one else in the room had taken the time to read. And then her eyes returned to him, calm, unwavering, her voice no louder than before. "I am not causing trouble," she said, and the simplicity of it seemed to land heavier than any argument could have, because it was not a defense, not a plea, just a truth stated plainly in a room that had begun to forget how to hear it. And still, no one moved. Officer Brooks felt the room pressing in on him now, not physically, not in any way that could be measured in feet or inches, but in the subtle shift of attention, the way silence could carry weight when too many people chose not to speak. And he adjusted his stance again, squaring his shoulders as if posture alone could restore the certainty he had walked in with, his gaze briefly scanning the cafe, catching fragments of faces that quickly looked away, the man in the navy blazer now pretending to read an email he had not scrolled, the barista wiping the same clean surface for the third time, the manager hovering just behind the line where responsibility blurred into avoidance. And Brooks returned his focus to Evelyn, searching her expression for something that would justify the next step, some sign of resistance, confusion, anything that would make this simpler. But there was none, only that same quiet steadiness. And it unsettled him in a way he could not immediately explain, because he had been trained to respond to escalation, to raised voices, to movement, but not to stillness, not to someone who remained calm in a moment designed to move them along. And he exhaled slowly, his voice lowering just a fraction as he spoke again. "Ma'am, I am trying to handle this respectfully," he said, the words chosen carefully, as if framing the situation might restore control. And somewhere behind him a chair shifted, the sound sharp, then gone, and Evelyn's eyes did not leave his, her posture unchanged, her hands now resting lightly in her lap, no longer on the table, as if she had already placed everything she needed to say out in front of her and had nothing left to prove. And the light from the window caught again on the photographs along the wall, drawing a faint reflection across the polished frames, and Brooks followed that reflection for just a second, his eyes landing on one of the images, a ribbon-cutting ceremony, a group of smiling faces frozen in a moment of celebration, and he looked away quickly, dismissing it as background, irrelevant. And yet something about the way Evelyn had glanced at that wall earlier lingered, a detail he had not meant to notice but could not entirely ignore. And the manager stepped closer now, his voice quieter, directed more at Brooks than at her. "We have had complaints," he said. The words offered like a justification that did not need specifics, and Brooks nodded once, accepting it, because it fit the pattern. It gave shape to the situation. He understood, and he turned back to Evelyn with renewed firmness. "I am going to need you to stand up," he said, not louder, but more final, and for a moment nothing happened. The room holding its breath again, as if waiting for gravity to decide which way it would fall, and Evelyn drew in another slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling with quiet control, and she looked down briefly at the table, at the cup, at the receipt, then beyond them, as if seeing something layered beneath the present moment, something older, deeper, and when she spoke again her voice carried a different kind of weight, not louder, not sharper, but steadier, rooted in something that did not shift with the room around her. "This place did not always look like this," she said softly, her eyes lifting once more, not to challenge, but to state something that felt larger than the moment itself. And Brooks paused, just for a second, because the sentence did not fit the script he had been following. It did not move things forward in the way he expected. It opened something instead, something he had not prepared for, and behind him the manager's posture stiffened slightly, a flicker of tension crossing his face before he masked it again, and the cafe remained silent, every small sound amplified, every breath measured, as if the room itself had begun to sense that whatever came next would not be as simple as it first appeared. The words settled into the room in a way that did not demand attention, but quietly took it anyway. And for a moment Officer Brooks did not respond, his training offering no immediate reply to something that was not refusal, not compliance, but something in between, something steadier, and he shifted his weight again. The faint creak of the floor beneath his boots sounding louder than it should as his eyes moved once more toward the wall of photographs, this time lingering just a second longer. Noticing details he had ignored before, the dates etched into small brass plates, the older styles of clothing in the earlier pictures, the way the building itself looked different in those captured moments, less polished, less refined, as if it had been shaped over time rather than designed all at once. And Evelyn followed his gaze without turning her head, as if she already knew exactly what he was seeing, her voice soft but certain as she continued. "It used to be a community center," she said, her fingers folding gently together in her lap, "before the renovations, before the new owners came in and changed everything." And the manager's posture tightened again, subtle but visible now, his arms uncrossing as he stepped forward. "Ma'am, that is not relevant," he said quickly, too quickly, his tone still polite, but now edged with something sharper, something that suggested discomfort rather than authority. And Brooks glanced at him briefly, catching that shift, filing it away, without fully understanding why it mattered, and then back to Evelyn, who remained seated, her presence unchanged, her calm not defiant but anchored, as if she was not resisting him but simply refusing to disappear. And a faint murmur rippled through the room. Not words, not yet, just the sound of attention shifting, people beginning to listen whether they intended to or not. And Evelyn lifted her gaze slightly, not to the officer now, but toward the far end of the cafe, toward the glass doors where sunlight spilled across the floor in a bright, steady line. And for a moment her expression softened, not with nostalgia exactly, but with recognition, as though she were standing in two versions of the same place at once, the present layered over something older, something that still lived beneath the polished surfaces and quiet rules. And when she spoke again her voice carried that same quiet weight. "There were folding chairs where those tables are now," she said, her eyes returning to Brooks. "And people came here because they needed somewhere to go, not because it looked like this." And the words hung there, simple but expansive, stretching beyond the immediate moment into something larger, something that did not fit neatly into policy or procedure. And Brooks felt that shift again, that subtle pull away from certainty, his jaw tightening slightly as he tried to bring the situation back into focus, back into something he could resolve. "Ma'am, I understand you have history here," he said, though it was not clear that he fully did. "But right now I need you to comply." And the word landed heavier than he intended, echoing faintly in the silence that followed. And Evelyn nodded once, acknowledging the word without accepting its meaning, her hands still, her posture unchanged. And for a brief moment she looked past him again, this time toward the manager, her gaze steady, knowing, and the manager's eyes flickered away almost instantly, as if he had been seen in a way he was not prepared for. And that small reaction did not go unnoticed, not by Brooks, not by the few customers who had begun to watch more openly now, their attention no longer hidden behind lowered eyes and glowing screens, and the room held that tension, quiet but growing, as if something just beneath the surface was beginning to rise, something that had been overlooked, dismissed, or forgotten. And for the first time since he had stepped into the cafe, Officer Brooks felt the situation slipping, not out of control, but out of simplicity, becoming something else entirely, something that would not resolve with a simple command or a quiet exit, something that was waiting, just beneath the surface, to be revealed. The tension did not break, it thickened, settling into the space between every table, every glance, every breath that felt just a little too measured now. And Officer Brooks straightened fully, the last trace of hesitation hardening into procedure as he stepped closer, not abruptly, not aggressively, but with the quiet finality of someone who believed the moment had gone on long enough, his voice steady, lower now, meant to close the distance rather than open it. "Ma'am, this is your final request," he said, each word placed with precision, as if clarity alone could resolve what had already begun to unravel. And a faint murmur moved through the room again, no longer just shifting attention, but something closer to discomfort, the kind that made people adjust in their seats, glance toward exits, consider leaving without actually standing, while the barista behind the counter stopped moving altogether, her hands resting against the edge as she watched, not hiding it anymore. And the man in the navy blazer lowered his phone completely now, his eyes fixed on the scene with a quiet intensity that suggested he was no longer willing to pretend it was not happening. And Evelyn remained seated, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that seemed to anchor the room even as everything else felt uncertain, her gaze lifting slowly to meet Brooks again, not challenging, not pleading, simply present. And for a moment it felt as though time stretched, not stopping, but slowing just enough for every detail to settle into place. The faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant sound of traffic beyond the glass doors, the soft clink of a spoon someone had set down without realizing they were still holding it. And Brooks extended his hand slightly, not touching her, not yet, but indicating the expectation clearly. The gesture practiced, controlled, meant to guide rather than force, and still she did not move, her eyes shifting past him once more, this time holding on something longer, something specific, and Brooks followed her gaze instinctively, turning just enough to see what she was looking at. And there, near the end of the wall, partially obscured by the reflection of light, was a photograph larger than the others, its frame darker, older, and in it stood a small group of people in front of the building as it once was, simpler, less refined, and at the center of that group, just slightly forward, was a younger woman, her posture familiar in a way that did not immediately register, her expression calm, composed, her presence unmistakably steady even in a frozen image. And something in Brooks paused, not fully, not enough to stop him, but enough to register that this moment was no longer following the path he expected, and behind him, the manager stepped forward quickly, too quickly. Again, his voice cutting through the quiet with a sharp edge he could no longer hide. "Officer, we need to proceed," he said, the urgency in his tone no longer masked by politeness, and that urgency shifted the air again, turning attention into pressure, turning silence into something heavier. And Brooks turned back, his focus returning to Evelyn, his expression firm once more, the brief flicker of doubt pushed aside by duty, by expectation, by the simple need to finish what had been started. And yet, as he looked at her now, really looked at her, something did not align, something in her stillness, in the way she held herself, in the way the room had begun to bend around her presence instead of away from it. And for the first time the command he was about to give did not feel as certain as it had seconds before, hanging there, unspoken, suspended in a moment that refused to move forward the way it was supposed to. The room did not move forward, it settled into something quieter, heavier, as if the moment itself had decided to pause, and Officer Brooks lowered his hand slowly, not as a surrender, not as a decision, but as a hesitation he could not fully explain, his eyes drifting back once more to that photograph on the wall, the one that did not match the others, the one that seemed to hold a different kind of history. And this time he looked longer, really looked, noticing the small details that had been invisible before. The older brickwork behind the group, the faded banner stretched across the entrance, the way the people stood not in polished arrangement, but in something more natural, more grounded, and at the center of it, that same woman, younger, stronger in posture but carrying the same stillness, the same quiet authority that now sat just a few feet in front of him, and something in his chest tightened, not sharply, not painfully, but enough to register that what he was seeing and what he had been told did not align. And behind him the manager shifted again, the sound of his shoes against the floor sharper now in the silence, his voice lowering but carrying urgency that could no longer be hidden. "Officer, this needs to be handled," he said, each word pressed slightly, as if trying to push the moment forward by force of tone alone, and Brooks did not immediately respond. His attention still caught between the present and that image, the two versions of the same space overlapping in a way that made the room feel different, less certain, and Evelyn remained exactly as she had been, her hands resting gently in her lap, her posture unchanged, her presence steady in a way that did not demand attention, but now held it completely, and the light shifted again, brighter now as the sun cleared the clouds, filling the cafe with a soft warmth that touched everything equally. The tables, the counter, the faces of the people watching, and finally her face, illuminating the lines that time had written there, lines that spoke not of weakness but of endurance, of having seen moments like this before and choosing, each time, not to let them define her, and she followed his gaze without moving her head, as if she knew exactly what had begun to settle in his mind, her voice quiet when she spoke, almost blending into the hum of the room. "That was taken before they changed the name," she said, her words simple, offered without explanation, without insistence, and Brooks glanced back at her, the connection between the image and the woman now impossible to ignore, though still not fully understood, and a subtle shift moved through the room, not loud, not dramatic, but real, as if the people around them had begun to sense that the story unfolding was not the one they had assumed at the start, and the barista took a small step forward from behind the counter, not intervening, not speaking, just closer, drawn in despite herself, while the man in the navy blazer leaned forward slightly, elbows resting on the table now, his attention fixed, no longer pretending distance, and Brooks exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, the certainty he had carried into the cafe no longer sitting as firmly as it had before, and for the first time since he had spoken that first sentence, he did not issue another command, did not repeat the request, did not move the moment forward, and instead he stood there, caught between instruction and instinct, between what he had been told and what he was beginning to see, and the silence that followed was not empty. It was full, filled with the weight of something just beginning to surface, something that had not yet been said, but was already changing everything about the way this moment would end. The shift did not come with a sound. It came with a realization, quiet but undeniable, as Officer Brooks looked again at the photograph and then back at Evelyn. The connection finally settling into place not as a guess, but as something far more certain, something that made the entire moment feel suddenly misaligned, and his eyes moved once more to the small brass plate beneath the frame. The text faint from age but still readable if you took the time, and this time he did, leaning just slightly. Just enough to catch the engraved name that had been there all along. Evelyn Carter Community Initiative, 1998, and the words seemed to land in his chest before they reached his mind, the weight of them unfolding slowly, piece by piece, until the room around him no longer felt like a simple cafe, but something layered with history he had stepped into without knowing, and he straightened. Again, turning fully toward her now, really seeing her for the first time, not as a presence to be managed, not as a situation to resolve, but as a person whose story had been in the room from the beginning, waiting to be recognized, and the silence deepened, not tense now, but expectant, as if the space itself understood that something had just shifted in a way that could not be undone. And behind him the manager took a small step back, barely noticeable but real, his confidence slipping just enough to reveal the uncertainty beneath it, and Brooks' voice, when it came, was quieter than before, not weakened, but changed, carrying something closer to awareness than authority. "Ma'am," he said, The word no longer a command but an acknowledgement, and he paused. The next words not coming as easily as the ones before, because they no longer belonged to the same script, and Evelyn watched him with that same steady calm, not expecting, not pressing, simply allowing the moment to unfold at its own pace. And around them the room had begun to lean in, the barista now standing fully at the edge of the counter, the man in the navy blazer no longer pretending to be elsewhere, a woman near the door lowering her cup slowly, as if afraid to make a sound that might interrupt what was happening. And Brooks glanced once more at the photograph, then back to Evelyn, the connection now clear, undeniable. And with it came the understanding of everything that had felt off from the start, the stillness, the calm, the way she had not moved when asked, not out of defiance, but because she had never been out of place to begin with. And the realization settled into him fully now, reshaping the moment from the inside out. And he took a small step back, not dramatic, not performative, just enough to create space where there had been pressure before, and the gesture spoke louder than anything he could have said, and the manager's voice, when it tried to return, faltered slightly. "Officer, this is not necessary," he said. But the certainty was gone, replaced by something thinner, something uncertain, and Brooks did not respond to him. His attention fixed on Evelyn, his posture no longer rigid but grounded in something quieter, something more human, and for a moment longer no one spoke, because the truth had already entered the room, not announced, not declared, but revealed in a way that made words almost unnecessary, and it hung there, filling the space, changing the way everyone present understood what they were witnessing. And for the first time since the moment began, the power in the room no longer belonged to authority. It belonged to truth. The silence did not shatter. It softened, shifting from tension into something heavier with meaning. And Officer Brooks let out a breath he had not realized he had been holding, his shoulders lowering fully now as the authority he carried at the start of the moment gave way to something more grounded, more aware. And he looked at Evelyn not as a situation, but as a person he had failed to see clearly until now. His voice, when it came quieter than it had been before, stripped of command, stripped of distance. "Ms. Carter," he said, the name careful, respectful, as if acknowledging it properly mattered. And for a brief second he paused again, not because he did not know what to say, but because he understood now that words carried weight here, that they needed to be chosen with the same care she had shown in every movement, every sentence. And he nodded once, a small, genuine gesture. "I apologize," he said simply, the words landing in the room without force but with clarity, and they changed the air in a way nothing else had, because they were not spoken to resolve the moment. They were spoken because they were true. And behind him the manager shifted again, this time more visibly, his posture tightening as if the direction of the situation had moved beyond his control. "Officer, that is not necessary," he said quickly, but the words felt thin now, unsupported, and Brooks did not turn toward him, did not engage, his focus remaining where it belonged, and Evelyn watched him. With the same calm she had held from the beginning, her expression unchanged, not satisfied, not vindicated, just steady, and she gave a small nod in return, acknowledging the apology without making it larger than it needed to be. And for a moment neither of them spoke, the space between them no longer charged but quiet, grounded, as if the conflict had dissolved not through force but through understanding. And the room responded in subtle ways, the barista exhaling softly, the man in the navy blazer leaning back in his chair, tension releasing from his posture, a woman near the door lifting her cup again, but slower now, more aware, as though something had shifted not just in the moment, but in the way she would see the next one. And Brooks glanced briefly toward the wall again, toward the photograph, then back to Evelyn, the connection between past and present now clear in a way that made the earlier commands feel distant, misplaced, and he stepped back another half step, creating space not out of uncertainty but out of respect. And the manager, sensing the shift slipping further from his grasp, cleared his throat, attempting to reclaim control with formality. "Miss Carter, we were simply following policy," he said, his tone measured but strained. And Evelyn turned her gaze toward him now, her expression still calm, but carrying a different kind of weight, one that did not rise to meet his words, but simply existed beyond them. "Policies should remember people," she said quietly, and the sentence settled into the room with a depth that no explanation could have matched, and the manager did not respond. His eyes dropping for just a moment before he looked away entirely, and Brooks remained still, present, no longer needing to act, no longer needing to direct, because the moment had already resolved itself in a way that could not be undone. And as the light from the window continued to fill the cafe, steady and warm, it revealed something that had been there all along, not just in Evelyn, not just in the photograph, but in the space itself, a reminder that dignity did not come from permission and never had. The moment did not end with applause or raised voices or any kind of dramatic closure. It settled instead into something quieter, something lasting, as Evelyn gently reached for her cup again, her fingers wrapping around it with the same calm intention she had shown from the very beginning, and she lifted it slightly, not to drink right away but to feel its warmth, as if grounding herself in something simple and real after everything that had passed. And Officer Brooks remained where he was for a second longer, not out of obligation, not out of uncertainty, but out of respect, his posture no longer rigid, his presence no longer imposing. Just a man standing in a space that he now understood differently than when he had first stepped inside. And he gave a small nod, not formal, not rehearsed, just genuine, before turning slightly, creating a path instead of blocking one. And the shift was subtle but unmistakable, because it was not about stepping away, it was about recognizing that there had never been a need to step in the way at all. And the manager said nothing now, his earlier certainty gone, replaced by a silence that felt more appropriate than anything he could have added, his attention drifting toward the floor, toward anything that did not require him to meet the moment directly. And around them the cafe began to breathe again, not all at once, but gradually, as if the room itself needed time to return to motion, the barista picking up a cup and setting it down again with quieter care, the man in the navy blazer finally leaning back fully, exhaling as though releasing something he had been holding without realizing it, a woman near the door adjusting her coat before stepping outside into the sunlight. And yet even as the normal rhythms returned, something had changed, something small but permanent in the way people moved, the way they looked, the way they chose to notice what was in front of them. And Evelyn remained seated, not lingering, not making a statement, simply continuing her morning as she always had, her presence no longer questioned, no longer challenged, just accepted in the way it should have been from the start. And her eyes drifted once more toward the wall of photographs, resting briefly on that image from years ago, the one that had quietly held the truth long before anyone had thought to look for it. And she allowed herself the smallest smile, not of victory, not of triumph, but of recognition, as if acknowledging a story that had come full circle without needing to be told out loud. And the light from the window stretched further across the floor now, touching the edges of tables, the legs of chairs, the shoes of those who remained, and finally settling again at her feet, steady and warm. And in that quiet, unspoken way, the moment closed not with words but with understanding, the kind that lingered long after voices had faded, the kind that reminded everyone who had witnessed it that dignity does not announce itself. It simply remains, waiting to be seen.